Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you all had a good lunch and plenty of coffee and are ready to dive with us into one of the most critical topics confronting governments around the Baltic Sea and indeed far beyond its boundaries. That is, of course, energy, focusing on the issues now more pressing and interrelated than ever of energy security, energy supply, and the energy transition. Together, these questions have risen to the top of government agendas in the wake of Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, which triggered an energy crisis across a region long reliant on Russian fossil fuels. Germany, of course, stands out here. Its Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were the product of multi-decadal Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade policies vis-à-vis Russia, practical domestic desires to secure cheap and steady supplies of energy, and a so-called gas bridge for its renewables-based energy transition, or Energiewende. And this saw Germany become reliant on Russian pipeline gas alongside its continued dependencies on Russian oil and coal. This bridge, to Russia at least, has collapsed following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Former State Secretary for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Patrick Reichen, went so far as to state in March 2022 that Putin had broken the narrative of natural gas as a bridging technology for Germany's Energiewende, again, the national energy transition project. But has it? Since 2022, Germany has successfully shifted away from Russian fossil fuels at a cost, for example, replacing Russian gas with Norwegian gas and LNG sourced from the US, Qatar, and elsewhere. Numerous challenges remain, however, and the transition, security, supply nexus remains in flux. To tackle these and other pressing issues, we are privileged today to have with us a fantastically knowledgeable and experienced panel. So, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. All the way from the other place, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Katja Yefimova, Senior Research Fellow in the Gas Research Program of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Dr. Yefimova has served as an expert for the UNECE group of experts on gas since January 2015, and on the EU-Russia Gas Advisory Council from 2012 to 2016. Her main areas of research include EU pipeline gas and LNG regulation, the regulation of decarbonization, and the transit security of Russian gas exports to Europe. She holds a DPhil in geography and an MPhil in Russian and East European studies from the University of Oxford. Katja, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you once again for an invitation, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to walk you through where we're now in terms of emerging from the energy crisis, because a kind of a consensus view now that the energy crisis is pretty much over in Europe, or at least the worst of it is over, and the question is, of course, looming, what is next for European gas security and for Germany, obviously, as well. As I think if I use Chekhov's quote, any fool can deal with a crisis you try to, it's really the day-to-day life that wears you out. So, the crisis is behind us, but what's next, and how the emerging challenges are going to be addressed, that I'm going to look at in more detail. So just to set some context in terms of European-Russian energy relationship, obviously it's the biggest crisis after the Cold War. And the EU, in response to the events of 24th of February 2022, introduced massive sanctions on all the sectors of the Russian economy, including energy sector, prohibiting pretty much most of oil imports and coal imports and oil products as well. But gas sort of remained untouched for a long time. It's only very recently, virtually weeks ago, that the EU, for the first time, directly targeted Russian gas, specifically Russian LNG, liquefied natural gas, imposing a ban on transshipment of Russian LNG in European ports. And transshipment meaning that Russian gas, mostly from Yamal project in the Arctic, comes into Europe in big ice-class tankers, and then sort of reloaded on smaller ships, either via ports or ship-to-ship directly, and then goes either onward to Asia mostly, or to other European countries. So the transshipment with onward delivery for Asia has been banned now, and that's coming into effect in 9 months' time. There was prohibitions on technology and services for new Russian LNG projects, And of course, in place now very much this EU political aim to phase out Russian gas as soon as possible in Versailles Declaration. And the EU policy came a long way from trying to reduce its dependence on Russian gas, which had been the case for a very long time, to actually phasing it out completely now as a matter of security policy. There is a plan for doing so. The European Commission developed the so-called Repower EU plan, which had sort of short-term measures, how immediately to deal with the crisis when it happened during 2021 into 2023, pretty much the worst of it. And that's diversification, that's attracting more and more LNG, that's investing in regasification infrastructure, meaning these LNG import terminals which would allow to import more liquefied natural gas into Europe, particularly Germany, because Germany until the crisis didn't have a single import terminal for LNG. Now it has 3, and they plan to have 3 more very soon, so it's massive change. And of course there are also longer term measures associated with energy transition, sort of increasing hydrogen production and imports in Europe, because you can't electrify all the sectors, so you kind of switch to hydrogen where you can. Those are much longer term, of course, things. But what the crisis has made clear that it actually, of course, it undermined Europeans' progress towards greenhouse gas emission targets by 2030, because a lot of replacement of Russian gas through coal, for example, took place in the short term, not in the least in Germany, but also in other countries. But at the same time, it's likely to accelerate energy transition, because it's believed that all this green energy is more secure because it's, it's domestic, it's independent. So now sort of energy transition is seen as an answer to 2 crises, energy crisis and the climate crisis, and these got reinforced. Of course, there is a note of caution that there are budgetary constraints. There's change in national governments. They change now reflected in the composition of the European Parliament, and there is some skepticism towards that. And of course, many countries in Europe are facing massive financial constraints, also not in the least that tens of billions had to be spent to deal with the crisis in 2022 to support businesses and citizens and shield them from huge price increases. So in terms of Russian gas, it's now no longer really a very big story. Pipeline gas exports to Europe fallen very sharply. Now they're about 20%, even less than 20% of pre-crisis levels, when Russian gas was about 1/3 of all Russian supplies. You can see it very vividly on the graph. So the dramatic drop on the top graph, and also since then, it's pretty much staying very low, this kind of low line on the graph at the bottom. And there are various reasons for that. But no sanctions, there are no direct sanctions or prohibitions on imports. These things happened because not available export infrastructure, for example, Nord Stream physically not available. Yamal pipeline through Poland is under mutual sanctions. The only routes they still serve Europe with Russian gas is ironically the Ukrainian route and Turk Stream under the Black Sea. Of course, several member states have introduced their own national bans on imports of Russian gas. It's Finland now doesn't accept through its terminals. Poland also refused to buy when there was a change in payment mechanism, when Russia requested ruble payments instead of euros for gas. Some countries introduced national bans, such as Estonia and Lithuania, and now Finland. So how this loss of Russian gas supplies got compensated? Mostly because demand dropped down dramatically in Europe in response to very high prices, but also LNG from all over the world, global LNG wave came into Europe partly to compensate for the loss. Again, as I said, Nord Stream is inoperable, and the irony is that Ukraine route is still functioning, albeit at much lower levels, and Turk Stream. So what will happen if no new post-2024 transit arrangement is agreed? That is possible. As you know, the transit across Ukraine expires at the end of this year. Consensus view, it's unlikely any arrangement will be found to replace it, but still could be. But the bottom line is the impact on the EU overall is not going to be significant, but the impact on specific countries such as Austria and Slovakia, which still very much depend on it, would be in terms of price at least, but if supplies are available, there are infrastructure to bring alternatives in. On the other hand, if there is continued transit across Ukraine, that could allow Ukraine to preserve its transit fee and alleviate price impact on Central East European countries. So global LNG to the rescue. As you see, this massive wave in LNG came to Europe to compensate for the losses, mostly from the United States, more than half of it, and then also Qatar and Russian LNG, because exports of Russian LNG actually increased in that time period. When I mentioned new terminals, you see these two maps, which there are all sorts of dots around Europe. Those are LNG terminals, allowing to import liquefied natural gas. And this European Commission's plan envisaged extra, 50 BCM by end of last year, and another 50 BCM by 2030. For context, before the crisis, overall capacity was about 200 BCM, so it's increase of nearly 50% in just about 7-year time. That's massive. A lot of it is in Germany, but also in other countries in the Netherlands and France. And that became known as sort of hunt for FSRUs. Those are floating regasification units that member states, hunted for because there was global shortage for them, just so they could stick it to their coastline and import LNG in the midst of the crisis. In terms of, the crisis is now over, so now what it means. And Europe, one must say, although it took all these measures to alleviate the crisis and spent a lot of money to alleviate the crisis, it also was very lucky, because the 2 winters when the crisis happened to be actually quite mild temperature-wise on record, which is a lot of residential consumption wasn't needed. And what it also means that in the longer term, Europe's dependence on imported LNG will increase dramatically, and that's a global market. It's not just Europe needs this gas; it all other places in Asia, for example, that have no other choice, will also need it, and Europe will be in fierce competition with these places as well. And what that means, that also will come with its own set of challenges, which were not present before, but will be very much picture of the future, and those challenges are of commercial, regulatory and physical nature. And just to list a few, those are about security of LNG infrastructure, that's about liquefaction, regasification, tanker fleet, so that these assets are secure and can operate as needed. There is also, of course, regional armed conflicts all over the world impacting security of maritime routes. For example, that was an impact on Qatari cargoes delivered through the Red Sea, and then they couldn't do that. That impacted the picture. There is also a big looming trend of climate change and weather-related impact on LNG production. For example, a lot of US production is centered in the Gulf Coast, which is during a hurricane season actually gets affected, and most recently this Hurricane Beryl closed and shut down some production, and if those trends are to be believed, those things are going to become more frequent and will have to be dealt with, and that affects obviously availability of gas. Or again, for example, in Brazil, where is during weather-related impact, is hydropower is low, then it needs a lot more LNG, which otherwise could have gone in other places, including Europe. It would stay in Brazil. And also regulatory changes. For example, most recently, this conversation in the US, the Biden administration paused on approval of new LNG projects, which the High Court sort of reversed for now. That's also European energy security becomes part of US domestic politics debate as well. And the last and not least, there are also sanctions on LNG production, because as I just mentioned at the start of presentation, the EU introduced sanctions on LNG production in Russia, followed by the US sanctions, which are already in place for some time. That sanctions sort of makes more difficult for Russia to produce LNG and delays it, makes it more expensive, but it also reduces global availability, which this gas could have gone elsewhere, for example, not in Europe. In the remaining minute or so, there's still a kind of back to the picture, because there's still Russian pipeline gas flowing into Europe, although in much reduced volumes. It's still underpinned, these volumes are still underpinned by so-called long-term supply contracts with take-or-pay clauses, meaning even if you don't take this gas, you have to pay for this gas, and billions of euros. Many of the contracts, virtually with all major European buyers, are now in arbitration for 2 years, and the expectations that those arbitrations will start delivering judgments very soon. In fact, one big judgment was delivered just weeks ago on the German company which nationalized Uniper versus Gazprom Export, and then the tribunal made a judgment which in many respects was surprising. It effectively enabled Uniper to terminate all the contracts it had with Gazprom. It's about 25 BCM. It's about 1/3 of total Europe take-or-pay supply portfolio from Gazprom. It's a big landmark judgment. What was surprising about the judgment that the tribunal appears didn't recognize Nord Stream physical unavailability as force majeure, which is surprising because normally it's a classic case of force majeure if you don't have infrastructure in place, if it's blown out, for example. And again, it's not certain that other tribunals which look at other contracts will have similar view or not. But this judgment is still very big because, as I said, it's 1/3 of European supply portfolio, take or pay. The tribunal also awarded Uniper the right to claim damages from Gazprom, although that's going to be very difficult, obviously, if at all possible. But what this judgment is doing, and particularly if other tribunals will follow it, it enables EU to reach its goal of phasing out Russian gas earlier, but at the same time, it would make Europe even more definitively and even more strongly, significantly reliant on LNG market, on global LNG market. And here again, I recall all the challenges now that will come with trying to secure or procure gas on that market. And to finish on sort of an uncertainty, but just kind of to throw a bit more complication into that Europe, if you look at its climate policy, at its net zero binding targets, and it's been very serious, which is reflected in all of its legislation so far on decarbonization, it doesn't really know by now how much gas it will need in either pipeline form or LNG form or from whatever places, how much of it will actually need post 2030. That's a big unknown, because if you look at all the forecasts, if it's short bars, which by 2050 meet this net zero target, it's a massive reduction in gas demand, and then Europeans sort of reluctant to sign long-term contracts for LNG beyond 10 years, and LNG developers, they're reluctant to develop the projects on anything less than 20 years. That's sort of a square to circle, if you like. And on that note, I'll finish and pass back to Trevelyan and questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Katja, for that tour de force through the shifting gas landscape. Next at the podium, I'm thrilled to welcome Sven Egenta, editor-in-chief of the nonprofit journalism platform Clean Energy Wire, or CLEW, which he founded in 2014. As executive director of 2050 Media Projekt GmbH, or G GmbH, I should say, he also oversees climate communication site klimafakten.de. Sven has covered the German, Swiss, and UK economies for Reuters, formerly as UK Chief Economics Correspondent until 2013, and has taught journalism at Kingston University. He holds a master's degree in journalism from Boston University, as a proud son of Massachusetts, that makes me very happy, and a diploma in economics from the University of Münster. Sven, the floor is yours.
You found it for me. Very good.
You do the best here for you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Trevelyan, for the nice introduction. And yeah, I'm really thrilled indeed to be here. I thought, as a journalist, I'm bringing now some sort of more blunter views in there, but I heard, the debates are already very engaged and engaging, so maybe I'm almost more moderate than I thought I would be here. Yes, as Trevelyan said, we are, only needs to, down here. We are a small nonprofit doing climate communication and journalism. On the energy transition, we started foundation funded to make the German story more accessible, but we found that the dialogue actually around energy and climate policies in Europe is, often missing on a media level and public diplomacy, as I mentioned, level before. Hence, we broadened our remit over time to covering the German, very intensively, the German policy scene, but we're connecting the dots across Europe. And we work actually effectively with media across the world who use us as a resource, and we train people on climate action relevant energy transition topic. We've worked with 1,500 journalists now in person through all types of workshops, in particular by taking them to the story, and that will be relevant for that particular one we're talking today about, because that gas bridge, we tried to visit it, and that had some really interesting implications. We have 465 network members globally covering that. Now, when I thought about the topic today, it was like, oh, were we all surprised? Not this community here, but many in media in Germany and probably elsewhere as well, in the western part, hemisphere, let's put it that way, of Europe. And I looked back, actually, to what we did ourselves when we started in 2014. What was one of the big packages that we put out? And one of the first one was the question, how does the energy transition actually relate to foreign policy and geopolitics? And I just put that up here to basically only point to one line. And again, for this community, this might not be so special. But at the time already, the second line read, the Ukraine crisis has brought the risks of Germany's dependency oil and gas and coal from Russia into focus. And then while some experts say, we should keep ties, others warn, and so on and so forth. Now, ultimately, from our own experience, from our own reporting, actually, if you read the whole story package, from our own reporting, and also from our experience of working with journalists from the Baltic states, from Poland, from other Eastern European countries, you cannot call it other than the chronicle of an energy crisis foretold, but not heard for whatever reason. And that is something that we, already discussed over lunch. How does information actually then shape policy, and how do views get included into national debates? Because ultimately energy policy for a long time was a national debate, especially Germany. Energy transition, we called it a solo in one of our other pieces when we looked into the European dimension. Now, this is a program we ran in 2017 where we took 15 journalists from across Europe to discuss the role of fossil gas in the energy transition, the famous gas bridge. Was it really necessary? And what would it look like? Who was involved? And we took people to Berlin, and then we went to Lubmin, where Nord Stream 2 was supposed to come ashore. I don't know how you say that, to land. And the interesting moment I remember very vividly was sitting in the room where we invited the foreign policy experts, the security policy experts, an official from the Polish Foreign Office, an official from a German government, some experts from think tanks. And it was really fascinating to see how a group of people can talk about the same subject and not are not on the same page. It was really palpable that there was not a dialogue going on. There were two monologues that left a lot of the journalist colleagues, we are rather irritated. And for me personally, it's really stuck in my mind when we talk about why didn't that translate into more. Well, we know what it translated into ultimately. That has been mentioned a few times now. It's interesting to see from our perspective how the German energy transition has always been framed as, yes, in foreign relations, it's important that we show the world that it can be done, to go all renewables. We show the business case, we show the cost, the security element, and I can say that up to a very late point, it simply didn't come up in the domestic debates for sure, but even less so in the debates that we witnessed internationally. Again, in this community, this might look different, but from a media perspective, the questions were costs, were export opportunities, is the world laughing about us because we phase out nuclear, but it wasn't about security. Up to that point, for sure, when that was the tipping point, and now we renamed our fact sheet, which we called Nord Stream 2, connecting Germany to Russia, splitting Europe, and that was, we changed the headline then now to symbol of failed German bet on Russian gas. Now, where did it lead to? You know, Katja has mentioned that as well, actually. You know, there was a moment of reckoning, obviously, and, you know, a flurry of activities to sort of substitute the Russian gas imports. But it also led to another recognition, and that was quite remarkable, that in one go, the domestic debate about the role of renewable energy was gone, at least on the mainstream party side. I mean, Christian Lindner called, the head of the FDP, and finance minister called it freedom energies, which obviously also was a significant shift from a party that was rather skeptical that renewables had a larger part to it, and actually campaigned in the previous parliament election on a sort of rather renewable skeptical position. Just as a quick reminder, we're, you know, sort of the German priorities in the largest scheme of things are when it comes to climate and energy. I always see these connected because at the heart of any climate action sits the energy transition, the move out of fossil fuels on all sectors and all levels. Now, the goal is climate neutrality 2045, the coal exit ideally by 2030. In law, it's enshrined 2038. The nuclear exit by 2022, which then was postponed by 4 months as a sort of reaction to the Russians' aggression and the energy crisis. 80% renewables in power consumption by 2030. And then that last line, I sort of like condensed what, and Katja said the same thing, you know, there is now a new debate what the new sort of backup fuel for renewables-based system will be on all levels, and that's hydrogen, which has a lot of geopolitical questions as well, frankly, but that's probably not the topic of today. Now, another thing that it's worth stating even now, even after all the issues that we've seen and faced and the threats, the German public in general you know, stands behind the goal of an energy transition, though this idea there is a backlash in a broader sense doesn't stack up. Politically, and especially party politically, things play out quite differently. But, you know, depending on how you aggregate the numbers, you know, it's somewhere between 68 and 86% that partly or fully agree with the goal of an energy transition. Where are we now? Early 2024, nuclear is out, coal is down. Yes, there was a spike in the first reaction, that's true, but you know, we're in a downward trend now again, and the general goal is not put into doubt. And renewables are now at 56% of German power consumption. In the first quarter, it's probably a bit more. In the second, we don't have the data yet. That's what it looks like on a chart. The question, you know, how you build a renewables-based system, you know, is now a lot of activity has been done in unblocking the renewables expansion. And we can see this now. We have a solar boom now again. You know, balcony solar is a new big thing. You can start talking about the psychology of that in the context of a security threat. But you know, that direction is pretty clear. But when it comes to the politics, and that relinks to all these questions that have been raised already about where the German public stands, there's a long list of things that are part of the sort of energy transition climate portfolio that have a direct or indirect link to the debate, to the security debate ultimately, and to the geopolitics behind that. Heating and buildings decarbonization is the question about natural and fossil gas. That is the question how much LNG will be needed in the future, because you know it's so far pretty much gas. That was the main issue in replacing Russian gas in 2022. A lot of people talked about electricity production, but the main issue was heating, keeping people's homes warm. That was the big story. Industry policy, the question how to decarbonize heavy industry and keeping the industrial base in Germany. And then it's also linked to obviously what the colleague from the DGAP earlier mentioned, the question of standard of living and good jobs. Decarbonizing transport, where you talk about oil another geopolitics issue that's not directly, well, indirectly is also linked to Russia and the global market here. The question of a fair transition and a compensation mechanism for the losers of the energy transition, which plays into social policy, and ultimately the whole question of foreign climate policy, raw material strategy, the overarching security aspects of the energy transition. And they're all being tackled to various degrees and with to varying impacts. No, doesn't let me. No, here we go. And leads to a concoction where energy topics, as Timo mentioned earlier, are sort of always hidden under other subjects like inflation. He mentioned migration. It's also the part of standard of living in general, and the question of regional discrepancies, especially when you talk about East Germany. And one of the key elements I wanted to point out, which I don't know whether that's a topic to be highlighted here, but there is something like a general, well, I don't want to call it another crisis, but there's a lack of trust now in that politics and policymakers will fix it in the sense of the wider public. That's obviously a very difficult one if you want to move on big things like the Zeitenwende, if there's a general doubt about whether it's done in the proper interest. And it would be worth discussing the role of the new changing the media landscape, the role of disinformation, the role of it not being centralized in sort of like gatekeeping media, but being all over the place. But the effects are pretty clear. We're seeing a rise in populism from the left and the right that builds on a sort of sense of uncertainty, and it's pretty clear that this is something that will be reflected, in particular in the state elections in Eastern Germany and coming up this fall. It is a special case, so I would hope that most people will look at it from that perspective, not to generalize it for everything, but there are some certain causes for concern that this is a way of thinking, the sort of like me first and let's stay out of everything else out there, that sort of seeps into the wider domestic debate. Yeah, and then obviously, the German government has realized that this is an issue. Obviously, you know better that it's not sufficient in many ways, but we could, the rush to new energy forms, to new corporations, to securing, the raw materials and the markets and all that in this shifting landscape has been visible and noticeable in the way of the diplomacy is done. Whether it's effective is a completely different story. I've just picked this one as one example. I mean, you can literally follow Jennifer Morgan now around the globe, and also always with this sort of joint message of energy transition as at the core of the debate. To conclude, at this point in time, when I look at what we should be looking for in this security context, I think one element I mentioned at our lunch as well is very noticeable, that we have a government that has decided to keep a tight budget at a time when it has some massive investment challenges, let's put it that way. One being security, that has been mentioned before, and the second one, being the whole change in the infrastructure necessary in the energy transition. That's really hard to see how this is going to play out, because it feeds into the third element where we talk about, well, let's just cut some social spending. I mean, at a time when, we see a populist surge from the left and the right, I'm not 100% sure that this is the way to secure a stable government in 2025. So, we will see how that's going to play out. And coming from Schwaben, where the proverbial Swabian housewife of Angela Merkel was originally invented, I have to say I'm not sure whether that's exactly the moment to keep the coffers shut. But on that, for one small political note, I would like to conclude and open for discussion.
Great. Many thanks for that insightful presentation, Sven. I think German energy policy and its motivations is really too often misunderstood, I think. And I believe our audience will leave today with hopefully a greater appreciation of what is and has been happening on that front in Germany now. Last, but certainly not least, I have the great privilege of welcoming Dr. Isabella Servillo, senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, where her research focuses on international relations and energy security in the Baltic Sea region, as well as Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Servillo's current work analyzes the development of new energy infrastructure projects in the Baltic Sea region and what role scientific knowledge and technical data play in the decision-making processes, and public communication around these projects. She also studies low-carbon energy transitions and wider political developments in Poland, Ukraine, and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Servillo holds a PhD in international relations from the Central European University. Isabella, we very much look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevelyan, and it's great to be here. Knowing that my excellent fellow panelists today will focus on Germany and Europe, I thought that in my presentation I will zoom in on the Baltic Sea region and analyze basically what has changed in energy sector of different countries, because of course the biggest shift we've seen was in Germany, but this is not the only shift that's happening, and there are a number of challenges going forward. So when we talk about Zeitenwende, I will, of course, focus first on Germany. A lot of things that I will cover here has been already said today. Historically speaking, of course, for many years, there was a specific policy in place in terms of German-Russia relations. There was belief in Berlin in this mutual dependence, in increased economic interdependence, and believe that increasing these energy relations will have positive impact on German and European energy security, but also that it will have sort of a spillover effect that will bring Russia closer to Europe and also make it more like politically integrated with Europe, so that it will also improve political security. So there was a mostly economic logic behind this policy, and as it was mentioned already today, there was basically, Russia was considered a reliable supplier, and as such, it made sense to keep importing cheap Russian piped gas instead of investing in alternative infrastructure. Then, if we think about the region, it's not just Germany and just the Baltic states. There are also Nordic countries. Here, it was also mostly economic logic. So it was not much of a security debate before 2022. The focus was rather on regional integration, sustainable transition, making the Nordic region the most advanced, sustainable green area. And those countries were in a pretty good position because they are quite self-sufficient, as they have big offshore wind capacity, which is expanding, nuclear energy. There's also oil and gas. There are also oil and gas deposits in the North Sea. And then, of course, we have countries of the former Soviet sphere, which is the three Baltic states and Poland, if we think about the region. And here, of course, the logic behind energy policy was very different for many years. It was security logic. And it was there because of historical experiences since the 1990s. So it was recognized in Moscow already in the mid-1990s that with a loss of strategic military presence in its near abroad, Russia will start using exports of fossil fuels as an instrument of political pressure. That was, of course, possible because of a network of pipelines for oil and gas that kept those countries of the former Soviet bloc basically locked in the system. So even though they became politically independent, they still had to import oil and gas from Russia. Oil, of course, is easier to diversify, but gas infrastructure is costly. It takes a long time to develop. So, of course, that was a much more difficult task. And in that context, Russia was able to exert pressure on the countries in its near abroad. And on a number of occasions, there were episodes of Russian energy blackmail or weaponization of energy. Those episodes, it was also mentioned today in one of the presentations, how Lithuanians were freezing in their schools. Those episodes always had sort of high degree of deniability, because Moscow could always say, oh, it was a technical, glitch, there was a problem with pipeline and so on, but they always corresponded with political and economic events in the importing states that basically run against Moscow's interests. So after that experience, of course, countries in Central Eastern Europe or the Baltic Sea considered energy policy really part of their security policy. And as such, it was not economic logic only that was driving investment decisions, but security logic, which meant that even though it was cheaper to keep importing Russian gas via pipelines, countries like Poland and Lithuania diversified early on. They constructed LNG terminals in Świnoujście and Klaipėda. They invested in pipeline infrastructure for interconnecting different countries in the region, Baltic Pipe project that started now in 2022, transit Norwegian gas via Denmark to Poland and further to region at large. There were also high security measures involved, meaning that because energy policy was security policy, this was really a top on security agenda. And this is important also now because that meant that those projects were highly securitized from the planning stages. For example, making sure there is no foreign interference of companies, for example, related to Russia when it comes to development projects such as nuclear power plant in Poland, or that the LNG terminal, such as the one in Lithuania, is strategically also located. It's close to military base. So there was also this aspect of protection of these projects in critical energy infrastructure. This also had, of course, the regional dimension, as we also heard today in a number of presentations. Nord Stream 1 and 2, this is the best example of how different the perceptions on energy policy were in the region. Nord Stream 1 and 2, in Central Eastern Europe, there were a number of issues with those projects. There was a fear of over-dependence on Russia, the fact that Russia can weaponize that project later on and blackmail not only the region, but also West. That there is that basically undermines EU solidarity because this was not discussed with the eastern neighbors, and that it deprives countries that were so far transit states of economic and political leverage. Economic in terms of transit fees, and political one, especially in case of Ukraine, because there was a long belief in Kiev that being an important transit state for Russian gas gives Ukraine certain leverage, both in terms of fees from transit, but also in dealing with Moscow, so in political terms. On the contrary, in Berlin, because there was a different logic driving this policy, developments in the region, such as, for example, 2006 gas crisis, where due to dispute between Russia and Ukraine, the flow was cut or lowered to the rest of the region. Development of those projects was seen as improving European energy security, that by circumventing the transit states, it will make it easier for the gas to flow without any interruptions, and that it will actually improve energy security for the continent. So fast forward to 2022, this is where we have, of course, the big shift in EU energy policy. Energy is weaponized also towards the West. There is a Repower EU plan, as Katia was talking about in greater detail. So there is a phase out of Russian energy imports, emphasis there on diversification, and of course acceleration of energy transition. And what each country is doing is very much dependent on what they've been doing before, because energy policy is still very much each state's national policy. Germany, of course, this is the biggest shift we see in the region. There is a shift in debate, where this geopolitical aspect of security of supply is really more appreciated. And in a rapid time and at a huge cost, Germany managed to also diversify its gas supplies through LNG terminals. Because Germany also stuck to its nuclear phase-out policy, this Zeitenwende in a way also plays into Energiewende, because it gives this additional push to accelerate the development of renewables further. But this is not the only country where shift occurred. For example, in Finland, Finland had very good relations with Russia prior to 2022, never experienced any episodes of energy blackmail. However, in 2022, after that, Russia was involved in the development of nuclear power plant in Finland, with Rosatom being one of the main stakeholders, and after that, Finland cancelled that project. There was, of course, issue also that was widely publicized with Baltic Connector that was adjoining Finland and Estonia. This was significant in a sense that it showed yet again after Nord Stream pipelines that we need to protect our energy infrastructure. It was not of a big impact on Finnish or Estonian markets because gas is not a big percent of their energy needs, however. And debate has also shifted in the rest of the Nordic region. So Denmark and Sweden, this is from energy policy being considered as an economic issue, also to being considered a security policy. Denmark, basically, that prompted Denmark to accelerate a little bit of its renewable energy projects timeline, especially when it comes to offshore wind. Sweden started to, it's also developing offshore energy, but it's also giving more green light to keeping nuclear energy as an option. So in their strategic documents, they don't talk only about renewable energy as a guarantor of this transition, but low carbon energy sources at the moment, which means that this has changed. And of course, when we look at the other side of the spectrum, here we have countries that, as Poland and Lithuania, they diversified their energy, especially in gas sources, way ahead of time. This was part of a long-term planning, so it was just a coincidence. For example, Poland had a contract with Gazprom that was just expiring at the end of 2022. That's why a number of projects in gas infrastructure were being put in place to be ready before that time. So it was just like a coincidence in that time. Both countries had LNG terminals and other sources. Lithuania was actually the first country to cut all energy ties with Russia when the war in Ukraine started. It was able to do that because of its domestic energy mix. There are other challenges, of course. Poland needs to phase out coal, and it's developing nuclear energy for the first time, also offshore wind. It's interesting to see that it was, as it was mentioned in some other presentations, renewable energy is seen now in the region not only as something that needs to be done because of EU climate agenda, but also because it's also another guarantor of sovereignty, energy sovereignty or energy independence, as it is framed in domestic debates. And then the other two Baltic states are also part of this interconnecting network of pipelines that improve their energy security in previous days. Latvia also has hydropower, but needs to invest more in renewables. Estonia has shale oil, which is also not environmentally friendly. It gives it certain level of independence, but it also raises other issues, so it needs to invest in low carbon energy sources such as offshore wind. It's also considering nuclear energy. So what does it mean for the region? Because it's quite fragmented picture. We have different countries doing different things. First of all, I think I can finish with three main points. One is that there is certainly convergence of perspectives in the region of what energy security implies. On the one hand, we have Nordic states and Germany looking at it more through the security prism as well. On the other hand, we have countries from the former Soviet sphere who are also now accelerating also their projects in low carbon energy, nuclear and offshore wind especially, because they see it as another way to become energy independent. The second point is that what we've seen in the last couple of years is that with the damage done to Nord Stream pipelines and Baltic Connector, there's a lot of infrastructure, undersea electricity cables, offshore wind farms, pipelines. They are usually those that are sited in maritime zones. They are especially difficult to monitor and protect. This is a challenge. It requires a lot of information sharing, costs. The governance of that is pretty fragmented, and it requires a lot of regional collaboration. So this is like something that countries will need to work together going forward. And this is a very complex issue. And there are also projects that, especially those that are in maritime zones, many of them are crossing different jurisdictional zones, so they are developed in cooperation with countries in the region, such as Denmark is developing what it's called, it calls it energy islands, so basically hubs for offshore energy that will be in maritime zones. They are being developed also in cooperation with Germany. They will improve regional security of supply. There are also projects that are happening there. And many of the companies from the West and also from the Nordic region are also helping countries such as Baltic states or Poland develop their offshore wind farms at the moment. And what's interesting to see is that there is this mutual knowledge transfer going on. On the one hand, there is a transfer of technology and all the technical know-how. On the other hand, countries which have like this stronger security outlook on energy policy insist on stronger security measures. For example, in terms of what kind of sensors or technology should be installed on the offshore wind farms to make sure that it's protected from different sort of attacks. So the learning is mutual, and there is some momentum to build on that and work together on the projects that developed jointly. And I'm out of my time, so I'll just finish here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I think a lot of food for thought there. A lot of different elements were raised, of course, in those last three presentations. And I just want to pick out a couple strands before I open it up to the audience. First, I suppose, actually, I'll ask you first, Isabella, given that you touched on this just now. Germany, of course, is often thought of as being the big culprit, of course, and ignoring the sort of security element and questions of security in how it approached energy policy. Of course, for all the Germans in the room, Germany was not alone here, right? I mean, Denmark also did this. I remember I was in Copenhagen some weeks ago and I spoke to your colleague about this. And of course, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, governments like Germany's, like Denmark, sort of woke up suddenly to this fact and were sort of left scrambling to sort of figure out what to do. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned sort of the word learning, right? That there's been learning involved here. I'm curious first, to what extent do you think these lessons, so they've been learned, or as you put it, heard, perhaps finally, but to what extent do you think they'll stick? Because once the war is over, which at some point it will be, surely there will be a temptation, in some quarters at least, to return to old habits. Mm-hmm. So I suppose that's the first question, which I'd like to put to you, and indeed, anyone else who'd like to chime in.
Yes, indeed, there was no debate on energy security as a security issue in countries like Denmark before 2022. I started to work in Copenhagen in 2020, and someone who deals with the topic of energy security and is from Poland, that was just interesting to me that no one is interested in that, and that was like a niche project we were doing. There is a bit of a difference, though, right, between country that is part of the Nordic region and is very self-sufficient, really, quite self-sufficient in energy generation, and between country that is a big European economy and is actively pursuing energy ties with Russia, even though the neighborhood has a lot of issues with that. To what extent it will stick? This is a good question. I think it remains to see, and a number of analysts in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment are wondering the same question. So at some point, once the war in Ukraine ends, and once perhaps if there is a change of political leadership in Russia, to what extent Germany will, countries also in the West, will want to reestablish these energy ties. And some people were talking here about Zeitenwende today in terms of opinion polls and whether German public really perceives Russia as a threat. But when it comes to energy sector, important factor are also German energy companies and businesses who lost a lot because of this, U-turn shift. So there might be like pressure there as well for these links to be reestablished and for making this transition still, cheaper than it has to be done without Russia or Russian gas. So I don't know what will happen. It remains to be seen. A lot will depend, of course, on the security situation in the region and what happens in Ukraine, pretty much.
Right. Thank you. Would either of you like to?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. You laid out the other players that are involved in keeping this going, especially the economy. Given that large part of the energy transition, the key question was always how can you stay competitive as an economy when you do this energy transition. That was the core story, and then the whole cheap gas fit nicely into this narrative. Now the question is, how can you shift this? And we are not talking about just the political groups here, but we're talking really deep down in business societal thinking ultimately of how we pursue ourselves, and we are here focusing on the energy question, but it has been mentioned before, this whole Zeitenwende idea of taking a more active role, of being prepared also militarily and all that. This is a massive shift in self-perception. And you could say maybe ending self-deception, but nevertheless, it's about changing the narrative of a country. We are an export nation. We're a trading nation. All of a sudden, we are the producers of all the goods the world wants. That's the key story, and not the question, how we can defend ourselves at the heart of the thinking. So, shifting this will need some resolve. Also, that brings me back to the prodding that was mentioned earlier. Sort of, or call it pressure, whatever you want from other countries. Yes, that is important. I would, from our own experience, and maybe I'll have to say this as somebody who's looked now into communication and how communication works and when it does not work, the question is how you do it. And as I said, if your words, even if they're correct, fall on deaf ears, you have achieved not very much. So I do sometimes think that, and that's why I'm, asked the question of public diplomacy, how that can work and how you can make a conversation actually effective. I feel there is, from our own experience, and I don't know whether you want to come back to the nuclear question, I can tell that this was a source of continuing misunderstanding, and that created rifts at places where there were actually natural allies, and Nord Stream 2 actually, the alienation of part of the natural allies, was maybe not crucial, but it played a role obviously in a large part of the ignorance, let's say, in parts of the climate community, for instance, in Germany on the subject.
Well, I think I actually have a question for you too, but I think since you raised that. Talking of natural, or in this case, perhaps more unnatural allies. I mean, in my research, so I did my PhD really looking at, as you know, the German energy transition. And in conversations that I had, for example, last autumn with leading politicians from all the parties represented in the Bundestag, one of the interesting things was that the two parties that sort of agreed with each other that Germany should still be importing cheap Russian gas. The left, and you had the AfD. So I'm curious if you could speak more a little bit to that, especially, of course, with Sarah Wagenknecht and what she's been doing with further to the left now. But then, since again you raised it, nuclear, and I will, I did want to return to that. There are, of course, those who say that in abandoning nuclear also fossil fuels, in the sense of Russian fossil fuels, right, especially gas, Germany is essentially replacing one sort of over-reliance, shall we say, in the case of gas specifically, and other Russian fossil fuels, with a new type of over-reliance when it comes to renewables, right? So pointing at China, for example. And this is, again, one of the arguments that is made in certain quarters, including those that I mentioned before. Less so, perhaps, Die Linke today, but certainly very much so the AfD. So I know that's quite a bit, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to some of that.
On the first question, I can only have to be honest. We still all try to understand what the party of Sarah Wagenknecht really is all about in its essence. Yes, we know why it exists. It's a place where frustrated people, rally around, a new hope. But what it stands for in essence, I find really hard to grasp. And I've put one of my correspondents on in preparation of the elections in East Germany to look into that specific situation. What is the attraction precisely, and what are the real factors that then might come to play when it comes to politics, if they ever get near, or to policies, if they ever get near regional government, and what is simply point scoring on the back of that what I showed, this relatively large dismay with conventional politics and policy making, and that's really hard to disentangle at this point in time. Second question. Well, there is in whole of Europe, I mean, you will probably speak to that, there is a big debate about reshoring, about strategic production on all sorts of materials and elements of the energy sector. You know, we're talking solar panels and all the raw materials. We're talking about mining again of certain rare, not only rare earth, it's just things like lithium and so on. In Europe, you know, you hear all of a sudden stories about in Eastern Germany, they're looking into certain types of minerals that might be worth digging up again. So there is a shift in the debate here too, that's true, which is sort of like, if you want, it's talking about learnings and being heard, maybe that's one of the positives that, you know, there is a certain sense now that if that could have happened with gas in the form of a Russian aggressor, maybe we make sure that it doesn't happen on other crucial elements. Now, for full disclosure, deep in my heart, you know, I think that this whole idea of protectionism and we do it ourselves ultimately is bad for everyone. The problem is only, you know, in order to keep an open trade and to keep a sort of like the flows going, everybody needs to play along, and then we're beautifully into game theory, which is probably here in Cambridge better dealt with than with me. But yeah, so there is an awareness now that you need to tackle this. How it will be tackled and how it will play out and at what cost, and then we're back into the social question, who will ultimately pay for it? That's a completely different story within a country like Germany, but I guess across Europe, that's the same story. You know, who will have to make, you know, which change and how will that be balanced within the European Union?
I just wanted to make a side note to that. I sometimes do wonder, looking at those different debates and also public support for different type of energy sources, it is not that people are not willing to pay more sometimes. There's of course a level up to how much more. It is what are they willing to pay more for? So, for example, there were these opinion polls being done in Germany for a number of years. Like, would you still support Energiewende if it, you know, and what level of price would be acceptable? So there is a ceiling. There is a ceiling, and then Central Eastern Europe. It also costs more to construct LNG terminal, like in Lithuania, like people get security additional on their bills when they see that they pay more for gas because it comes from like domestic terminal in Klaipėda, and they are willing to do that. Of course, there would be also a ceiling there, but I'm just saying is that economics, it cannot be just about economics, it's also about politics and geopolitics or our deeper values like clean transition or what do we believe in. It's just a matter of priorities, and those priorities look, now maybe there is some convergence, but they look very differently very often country to country or region to region. So that's just something to consider.
Thank you. Katja, I want to ask you whether you think we're seeing not just perhaps a supply shift, so, you know, replacing again currently, you know, Russian fossil fuels would say, you know, gas, LNG, et cetera, sourced from elsewhere, but also kind of more broadly a directional shift, because you know, I think, you know, you showed that wonderful image of, you know, all of these, you know, routes for Russian gas in particular going into Europe, and of course now, you know, we've seen Germany replace its Russian gas with Norwegian pipeline gas, with LNG sourced from other countries, and this of course is the same for many other countries across the EU and indeed other non-EU European countries. And I know I sort of touched on this in my first question that I put to Isabella in terms of whether, you know, this broader idea of a permanent shift. But I'm curious, especially when it comes to gas specifically, are we seeing sort of a more permanent directional end supply shift?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of comes back to the question I mentioned briefly in my presentation, whether one will see sort of a return of Russian gas into Europe and on what scale. I think it's very difficult to see a return on large scale. I think it's pretty much foreclosed on a scale that it was before. I don't think it's going to happen on such a large scale as it was under any scenario. And the question is now whether, you know, it returns at all and on what sort of, you know, small scale it might be. But here the question is really, I think, what will happen to these long-term contracts, which are still in place and in force. They're legally binding. As I mentioned, this big Uniper Gazprom case which went in favor of Uniper, it's no longer bound those obligations. It's not clear whether that will happen to all the remaining contracts. Some suppliers might want to see their contracts terminated, or some buyers might want to see their contracts terminated, particularly those whose countries have such political position, and those companies which are predominantly state-owned or state-owned completely. And some countries might not really want such termination. They might want to have some of those to continue because, some might view them as security risk, as dependence, and some might view them as a cushion, because if anything goes wrong with LNG supplies or whatever risks there might be out there, there is something to fall down to. And it's big difference if you depend on 30% plus on this, or you depend on something like 10-15%. And then it might not be such a big deal. And of course, if you look across the board, different European countries have very different perceptions. If you look at Hungary, it extended its contracts after 2024 to February 2022 with Russia, and some countries in the Baltic, they almost immediately passed national bans on imports. So Europe as such, or the EU as such, is also not uniform and a different position. And even if you look at the latest sanctions round that the EU adopted in terms of LNG, it feels like Europe has now more confidence that it can get out of Russian gas, more or less to a significant extent. The crisis is pretty much over. But also it's sort of uneasy that LNG supplies of Russian gas into Europe increase, because they partly compensated for lost pipeline supply, but nowhere near, obviously, it's much smaller. And there is an urge to do something, particularly because some member states driving really hard into that. They want to see more sanctions, and some member states are a lot more careful about it. Either they have more dependence, or they don't view it as a threat at such a low level already. So the compromise was banned is transshipment of Russian LNG in European ports. Effectively, that means that kind of will complicate logistics for Russian gas, but that really will affect Asian buyers mostly, because those transshipped cargoes go into Asia. Those that are staying in the EU, they stay in the EU. That's not going to change because of that. But it still shows you that the whole position is really about an art of compromise, and it's very difficult to see this kind of common position. But to me, the bottom line is really what happens to the majority of those big long-term supply contracts, which run well into 2030s, if they all kind of go out of the windows, or some of them remain. But if they all go, most of them go, then the future of Russian gas pretty much would be, kind of confined to supplies through Turk Stream, which is Balkans, Southern Europe, and Hungary. And maybe if the Ukrainian route is preserved, and then the widely divergent positions about it, some say it should stop, it expires anyway, it should not be continued. But some say Ukraine may retain transit fee, and it needs that money, and also it's alleviate impact of some Central European countries like Austria and Slovakia, which would be difficult for them in a short period to alleviate. So you really touch and go, but the question, which I think the answer would be near certain, is it will not return to anywhere near where it was. The question is really how low it will go, whether some margin will remain, and that is possible. But for many countries, that might not be a big deal.
Great. Well, you heard it here first. Bear that in mind. All right, we have some time for a few questions. If you just want to raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you. So I see 3. So let's take those as a group. So first, Naman, go for it.
Hi, my name is Naman Haptom. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Cambridge. In terms of the discussion of the weaponization of energy, there's some who would argue that actually the West are the ones weaponizing energy vis-a-vis the Russians, and the G7 price cap, discussion of central bank asset seizures. So I'm curious if there's a reputational risk for Europe in that it's actually being seen as an unreliable consumer of energy. And if you're Saudi, would you rather sell to Europe or to China? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. And then the next question, I believe the lady in the blue jacket over there.
Thank you. Nina Kuriata, Tortoise Media. This year, I've just compared 2 trackers, Russia's fossil fuel exports tracker and Ukraine aid tracker, and I discovered a shocking thing. that all European countries have paid to Russia 4 times more money than they gave as an aid to Ukraine, which is of course up to them whom to help and whom to not, but you can't play on the both sides at the same time in a way. So, and we see that Russia is very successful in avoiding sanctions because it increased its exports to Turkey, India and China, and it's increasing its LNG exports. However, they don't replace the pipeline exports. So, and we observe the discussion where we compare the security on the continent with the energy security of LNG terminals in Europe, for example. So I have a very short question to all experts in the panel. How would you prioritize security on the continent and energetic security?
Great, thank you.
On the continent, thank you.
And then the final question, Alex.
Alexander Greifswald. You all referred to a lot of fragmentation in the energy transition, and I wonder, wouldn't it be more resilient for the region to have a common energy market? This is not the question to answer here. The question is rather, is there a vision for a common energy market in the region or in Europe to overcome all these problems that you have raised here, to solve these problems and to keep actually the energy transition going and not going backwards?
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you all 30 seconds to try to tackle all of those.
Yes, probably.
Oh, really?
I mean, so is there a vision? Well, yes. I mean, you know, that what I showed Saudi Arabia, but I mean, if you look at the attempts that are going on right now in Europe to interconnect things better, and if you look at Germany, the interesting bit is how nationalism plays into these things. I mean, Germany had now flipped, for the first time ever, Germany had a net import balance of electricity. For the first time, for decades we had an export. It was always said, oh, you're exporting your subsidized electricity to Poland, all your dirty coal energy is going to export it. Now it flipped because of the closure of the last nuclear power plants and a flipped price situation. Tiny bit, German media bang out there, we are the electricity beggars of Europe. I'm like, great, this is the idea of a common market, you know, that as soon as you need, you know, an import or an electricity, you're a beggar. As soon as you're an exporter, everything is fine domestically, but everybody else is getting upset. So yeah, we have a long route to go there. But I think, you know, the people who work on that, my impression is they are really, but you can confirm that or not, that they're working on it. Security, I think those two cannot be separated, so it's a yes. Yeah, I mean, that not much more that I can say, you know, but then the balance becomes very tricky. Which step do you need to take first in order to achieve the overarching goal? And the reputational risk, well, if the goal is to move out of fossil fuels globally, that's the stated goal of the Paris Agreement, every single fossil fuel producer, and that's why I'm saying what we are seeing with Russia, get ready to see the same thing with the oil producers in a certain way, different type of action, but if the goal is to move out of fossil fuels, there will be a shift in geopolitics. If that's becoming true, and there's a global commitment to that, and the IEA has put that out as, you know, there's a pathway and all that. So maybe Europe has not a reputational risk, but runs the risk of being, you know, not trustworthy because they're moving out of fossil fuels, and that might end, you know, business relations on that level. It's hard to tell, but, you know, so it's a maybe. I don't know. It depends on how the global situation plays out in the question of phasing out fossil fuels in general, and who moves in a way that allows them to phase out their main source of income. If you take Saudi Arabia, if you take Venezuela, if you take, I don't know, who can move without creating massive domestic frictions and potentially regional conflicts. I don't know. Again, something to park in Cambridge and related institutions to look into.
Isabella.
Since Sven already answered so much, I think I'll just take the second question because I thought it was a very good point. Indeed, that's a huge problem. First, oil sanctions, many loopholes, basically exporting to India, EU buying like the next product, and gas sector as well. With LNG imports, when EU sometimes publishes those statistics, they look a bit different if we go a bit more backwards. And if we compare numbers from 2021, it actually looks, well, actually shipments to Europe of LNG are pretty high. So now, as Katia was mentioning, finally something's happening in that direction, but this is an important topic. Also, Russian shadow fleet, hard to keep a track on of what tankers are going through different straits and seas and how this trade is happening. And ultimately, we do talk about energy security here, but if the situation in the region doesn't get resolved in a way that would be acceptable to the European side, if it gets worse, then this is all intertwined. Then this is basically the security issue. So yes, thank you for the comment.
Thank you.
On the last point in terms of common energy market, there is already common energy market in electricity and in gas in Europe. It's internal energy market. It's heavily regulated. There are several packages of regulations on the EU level that's very successful. It's actually one of the reasons why Europe was able to deal with the energy crisis, with a very acute energy crisis, unprecedented in terms of gas, because gas flew across the borders pretty much freely and price signals, and there were no unilateral closing of borders, each country doing each own thing. And that's one of the answers why the impact of the crisis wasn't as bad as it otherwise would have been. So yeah, the market is in place, and in fact, there were, during this period, several emergency measures on a temporary scale were adopted to deal with the crisis on a national basis, and there was sort of a drive from some member states to do more emergency measures, and they will ultimately, if they stay for a long time, they would undermine the market, and actually they would make situation worse down the line. So it's really good that the European Commission was able to and the EU was able to stand back from that. So a lot of those more interventionist measures after the crisis, they were now rolled back. So the market is preserved because it's the best answer to the crisis. In terms of energy security versus security, they're not obviously necessarily mutually exclusive, and it's a matter of proportion, that's a matter of diversification, and it's a matter of how significant your dependence is. What happens if you lose that supply source? Is it a big drama, or it's not, because you can quite easily and quite inexpensively to replace it with something else? And any extreme dependence and over-dependence will come with its own challenges. Over-dependence on Russian gas obviously came with challenges. Over-dependence on global LNG, and I think I had a slide listing all sorts of challenges that could come into play. There are also separate challenges, and then the impact also could be quite dramatic potentially down the line. So it's all a matter of balance. And on the first question, in terms of other countries and whether, if you looked at the question, is it Russia refused to supply Europe, or Europe said no to Russian gas? So it's kind of a balance, because this Versailles Declaration, what it says, adopted very, very quickly after the invasion, is that we want complete phase out in Europe, and that's very new. That wasn't before. All the talk was about reducing dependence, not phase out. So that's a very, very big shift, and it's, from Russia's point of view, it's obvious that it's looking for other buyers, and eventually I think they will succeed in concluding this pipeline towards China, because China also in a tricky situation. It has pipeline supplies, it has LNG, most of its LNG, the LNG would be American LNG, US LNG, Australian, and Qatari, and again, China potentially has issues with the United States and potentially Australia, and Qatar is sort of more benign from the Chinese perspective. And where Russian gas comes in, of course, China will not want to see over-dependence on Russian gas as well. And it's also a matter of balance and how Chinese leadership decides to balance these things. And in terms of sanctions more widely, of course, the assumption, I suppose, was initially that in the West, that if sanctions are adopted, everyone is going to follow in the world. There is a big world out there, and nobody really else has followed. It's really remained the Western sanctions, and other countries doing their own things, and they're doing business with Russia, and they have their own national agendas, and they have their own multilateral fora, etc., etc. And that pretty much was predictable from the start. It just nobody really want to kind of think this way. Now it's becoming very obvious that what it is. And in historical perspective, when sanctions were imposed, countries or states on which those were imposed in time, they would find ways of going around it. They would develop their technologies, they would do reverse engineering, they would do all sorts of things because they're forced to. They otherwise wouldn't do so. So that just obviously takes time. It costs more money, but it's also doable. So it's not uniform, and because it's not uniform, it's full of holes, and I don't think it's really fixable. But
Great.
Those means. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now to end on hopefully, well, perhaps it won't be a hopeful note, but I mean, this is, again, has been a view in the past that Germany across the region, right, we are talking about the Baltic in particular, the greater Baltic Sea region, has been a big part of the problem in the past in terms of its embrace of cheap Russian fossil fuels to the detriment of looking at broader security and indeed other concerns. Today, of course, the situation is perhaps quite different. And I just want to ask you, give a very quick response, perhaps even just a yes, no, or maybe. To what extent you see Germany actually now as maybe a big part of the solution, given its embrace of renewables now and its announcement that it intends to contribute in a big way and get other countries on board to really tapping into the huge potential for renewables, in particular, say, offshore wind right across the Baltic Sea. Starting with you, Katja.
I think I'll give Sir Humphrey's answer, yes and no.
Perfect. Wonderful. Yes and no. We'll take that. All right, Sven.
I follow Katja and say you made a very good point. Europe to this is the whole key. And, as long as we, the German policy making is better and more integrated on a European level, I think the better for everybody else. But, whether that's going to stay in the near future, I don't know.
I'll say maybe, but I think I already answered your question when I answered about Zeitenwende and how durable it is in energy sector, so I think it remains to be seen, but let's be hopeful because that would be very much needed. And there is a momentum now. There's really a momentum that this unfortunate conflict created that was not there before, so we should really try to get there.
Great. And speaking of durability in energy policy, nuclear, of course, Germany has exited nuclear. If, say, the CDU, CSU get back in power in the next federal election, do you think it's coming back, or is it now effectively dead in the water?
My standard answer is it will not come back.
Right. All right. So you heard many things first here. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a massive round of applause to our distinguished panel here.